Ding. Ding. All rise. I feel weird saying that. All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lauren Snyder, president of this wonderful club. Great turnout, by the way. Thank you for all being here this afternoon. Want to thank Dave Meyer for greeting us on our way in, and also our roundabout reporter, Jim Capshoot. I'll invite Tim Jessen up for our pledge and reflection.
Get the flag on the right
and
side.
We're going to get the flag over here. All right.
You do a good job. Well, I got all wrapped up. I don't care what Nancy's.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let me get out of here.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and you may be seated. Perhaps there are people here that do not know that Wayne Martin died since he was here with us last Tuesday. It just appeared in the paper this morning. I had planned something different for my reflection today, but sometimes interventions are welcome, and so I wanted to say a few words about Wayne, and there will be other opportunities later in this club. He was here at Rotary last week, and I'd hoped to sit between him and Ron Jensen, two of my very good friends, but when I arrived a little late, that seat was taken by someone going and getting their meal, so I didn't get that chance. I'm not sure how long it had been since Wayne had been here or at a Rotary meeting, but I thought it was a nice touch for him to come here because St. Mark's Methodist was his home church, and I believe he was a charter member or here at the very beginning. First, I was not too happy to learn that our displacement would continue from the Indiana Memorial Union, but perhaps it was providential, since this also was Wayne's place. I knew him here when we attended here for a while, and also through Rotary, and also as someone who was deeply interested in the work he did in the Monroe County Jail and to help offenders coming out of prison through New Leaf, New Life. Dave Meyer is going to say a little bit more about that at a later date, and we will have a chance to continue to remember Wayne. I didn't know him in his earlier days here at the university. I understood he came here in 1956, but what we saw at the end of his life was entirely characteristic of all of the rest of it. His early years were spent, though he was born in Texarkana, Texas, he was really a resident of Arkansas, and he had a long family association with Hendrix College, a Methodist college in Conway, Arkansas. It happens to be a college where my son and daughter-in-law have recently accepted positions, so I have a little connection there. Wayne was humble, caring, he could be witty and funny, but never pointed to himself, but always to others. I never did get to go with him to the jail for jail bingo, but I was invited many times. As I understand it, Wayne brought candy and other gifts that could be given to the folks there after they enjoyed the game of bingo. Others have tried to continue that generosity when he was unable to do so. And New Leaf, New Life is a wonderful ministry in this community that bears Wayne's footprint all over it. He cared for the less fortunate, those often rejected by society, and sought to bring them comfort, a little bit of excitement, and mostly genuine Christian love. He was authentic and real, representing the very best of America, Rotary, and United Methodist values. We will miss him and pray that our good works may follow his. Dave Meyer is just going to briefly tell you when his memorial service is, because we will not meet before that occurs. Dave?
Sure. So Wayne will be memorialized here at St. Mark's, actually in this hall and right next door, On Sunday, November the 4th, there'll be a reception or viewing the hour before the service at 3 p.m. on Sunday the 4th of November. And then at 4 o'clock, there'll be a service. And since we mentioned New Leaf, New Life, the family has asked that if anybody would like to bring donations of hygiene materials for the jail bingo program, you're welcome to. There'll be a box to collect them. Full-size bars of soap, full-size bottles, plastic bottles of shampoo, or full-size tubes of toothpaste will be most welcome and be distributed to the inmates in the Monroe County Correctional Center. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much, Tim and Dave. Sarah, our introduction of some guests.
So we have Kathy Fuentes-Rauer with us from the Monroe County School Board and Hoosiers for Public Education. There she is. Stand up, Pat. Charles Savage is a guest of Susie Graham. Welcome. Cody Schweigart, guest of Liz Irwin from Smithville Fiber. Ann Bright, a guest of Jim Bright. Rita Oates, a guest of Bill Oates. There she is. And Ann Fraker, a guest of Dick Rose. You're going to just become a member before long. Bye.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Birthdays this week. We have Michael Wade on the 21st, Charlotte Sitlow on the 21st as well. You share that together. Susie Graham on the 22nd, and Jim Santo also on the 22nd. Happy birthday. Membership anniversaries, George Boone, 10 years, and Bill Murphy, 11 years. Now, Bill, how many years have you been Rotarian altogether? This is just our club, so. Just our club? Okay, all right. Some additional pre-program announcements. Reminder, the Business Outlook is on Thursday the 1st at noon at the Woolery Mill. The regular Tuesday, aka next week's meeting on Tuesday, we will not be having the Business Outlook. We'll replace that on Thursday. Please make sure to sign up for that. The Rotary Toast, honoring Stephen Connery Ferguson on the 2nd. Our quarter lunch buddies I continue to get emails about that, which has been a lot of fun. 12 months of service, October 27th, this Saturday, from 9:30 to 11:30 at the Wonder Lab, Wonder Garden. Shouldn't be a lot of work, but Natalie will be sending out a sign-up genius. We need 10 volunteers. So please make sure. I'm even going to leave Ryla for a minute. I think Joy can handle it. I'm going to leave Ryla for a couple hours and go to the Wonder Lab and do the gardening for that couple-hour time period. So please respond to Natalie, or if you don't want to respond to sign-up genius, just let Natalie know so we have a list. Our Rotary 505 at Rick and Joy Harder's, thank you so much. We had over 20 people show up and I think had a great time. And has Ziggy recovered, most importantly? Ziggy had quite a shock with all those people at his house, right? And then also our board meeting, I don't want to go through too many details, but I'm very excited to announce that the board approved that we are going to pursue the water project in Myanmar that J.T. Waring presented to us a couple of weeks ago. We are going to be partnering with his organization and installing a well which will serve 500 plus individuals that don't have access to regular clean water. And I'm very excited about it. Jim Bright and I are going to lead that. And ultimately, when I'm done with my presidency come July of next year, I'm going to take over the International Service Project Chair. And that's going to be a passion of mine, as clean water, I think, is the next Polio Plus for Rotary. So I'm excited about that. And hope you guys will get excited about that. More to come. Susie, happy dollars. Who's happy?
Hey guys, I just got word. I think our Christmas holiday party for the club is going to be December 12th. So put it on your calendar, work with them about that. I just got word that it was in. So I'll get with you then. For the country club.
I'm happy there's money sport week, there's other things on the table, and I'm also looking for taxi ropes. I'm checking my way. the teacher's warehouse.
Today was I voted, and I just want to point out that it's not just a right, it's a duty to all Americans to get out and place your vote. If you don't like the way things are, you vote. If you don't vote, you have no say. Please, everybody vote.
Last week I anticipated the granddaughter's wedding. It came off, it was wonderful. They did a great job. We had a great time.
I have a couple of happy dollars. First, to salute you, Lord, for the Lunch Buddy program. Jeff Baldwin and I had a great time together. And secondly, there's going to be a joyous celebration of the life of our past president, Keith Brown, on this Friday. And the funeral is at 11, but at 10:40, there will be 24 trombones. The IU Trombone Choir will perform before that. So I encourage you all to come here. 24 trombones.
I'm happy because the Rotary Christmas party is on my birthday. Every year I can say it's the biggest party I ever had. But I too want to talk about how much fun the Lunch Buddy program is. Efrat and I had a wonderful lunch yesterday also. But also, I want to talk about the 505 of Rick and Joyce, which was wonderful. One of the things we discovered is that Rita Oates and I are both from KU, Lawrence, Kansas, yay, Jayhawks. But that we have a mutual friend who wrote a book, a novel, and so I'm passing my copy on to her. And it's about Kansas.
I'm happy because I'm going to spend next week in our New York to do Halloween with my two grandkids. It's the first time I've ever been able to do it. I don't know what I'm going to be.
All right, now I want to ask Tim to come back up and introduce our speakers today. Tim, go ahead.
Thank you. I want them to have as much time as possible, but I'll also give Susie an extra happy dollar because the speaker today wrote the foreword of introduction to my daughter-in-law's book recently published on selling schools, so I'm bragging on her. And that's how I became acquainted with the Lubienskis and found out they moved recently to Bloomington and the Indiana University School of Education after being in Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois and many other places, and they've written many other books and periodicals. But this one I thought would be of special interest to us. It's the public school advantage, why public schools outperform private schools. And so I'm very happy to introduce to you Chris. Where's Chris? Oh, back there. And his wife, Sarah. Welcome them to Bloomington and to our Rotary Club to speak about public education. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to get here and get such a warm welcome. Many people came up and said hi when we got here, and so many people who did that have a connection with public education. And I'll say that we're asked to speak about this book, which I think had some unexpected findings that you might find to be a pleasant surprise. We were actually not expecting these findings when we first did these analyses. So we'll talk a bit about that in the book. So just as an overview, we're going to talk a bit about the politics and policies surrounding school choice in the U.S. And of course, Indiana's kind of a hotbed for some of those policies, including look at some of the groups that are pushing these things and some of the different types of choices and the growth of choices in recent years. And at the same time, we're going to talk about one of the more professional-led reforms, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, which is NCTM, who, at about the same time that charter schools and vouchers were taken off in the U.S., also started to promote reforms based on the best research on how children learn, and in particular around mathematics. So we'll talk about those two things in tandem. But most specifically, we're going to focus on a number of studies that we did around the question of public and private schools and their effects, and look at some of the implications for that. And we want to leave time at the end for questions and discussion. So please feel free to, if you have anything you want to ask us, we'll definitely leave time for that at the end. So just as an overview, as far as choice in the United States, we all know about public schools, and many public school districts or corporations have now built-in choice mechanisms. Students can choose within the district or in some states outside the district, even across the whole states. And then private schools have also traditionally been a form of choice in the United States as well for people that would pay tuition for that. But in more recent years, in the last 25 years, we've seen the rise of other forms of school choice, such as charter schools. I think everybody being in Indiana, you're familiar with charter schools. You can think of them as publicly funded but independently or privately managed schools. And then vouchers, school vouchers. Again, it's a fixture in Indiana, but a number of states now have voucher programs or voucher-like programs, such as education savings accounts or tuition tax credits. So they are functionally equivalent to vouchers, although the mechanisms behind them are a little bit different. So to explain this a little bit more, and focusing on charter schools. Charter schools were actually an innovation that came out of the public education system. It was a former school principal named Ray Buddy who thought of this idea of what if we gave a group of teachers within a school or a district an opportunity to try something new in that district for, say, 5 years or whatever. We kind of shield them from competition. We give them a chance to explore a different way of learning or teaching, for example, and see what happens, kind of as a research and development effort within the public education system. That was embraced by people like Albert Shanker, who is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, who saw this as a real opportunity to advance teacher professionalism. But at the same time, it was also embraced by other people who thought this is a good opportunity to move towards a more privatized model of schooling, to bring in private providers, for-profit, nonprofit, for example, to manage public schools. And so there's been this kind of strange bedfellows in the charter school movement where you have some groups that are very much in favor of privatization of public education. At the same time, you have a lot of progressive education reformers who want to reach out to marginalized communities, for example, that have been traditionally underserved in public education. The schools, as I'll show you in a second, have grown pretty dramatically since the first charter school started in Minnesota in 1991. We've seen an expansion to the point where now about 6% of students in the U.S. go to charter schools. And they've also gone global. They're now, the charter school model has been exported to some degree in England with the free schools, in Sweden, but also Liberia, Colombia, New Zealand has charter schools, although they've just introduced legislation to roll those back. But it's become a part of a global education reform movement. So this is just a graph of the expansion of charter schools in recent years. And what you don't see here is that in the last couple of years, the growth has started to level off. I think we've reached saturation in a lot of places. The number of states, I think it's 42 states in the District of Columbia have charter schools, and we're not seeing a rapid expansion of additional states that are authorizing charter schools. However, that said, there are some places in the U.S., such as New Orleans, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, where a large proportion of the students in those districts are going to charter schools. In New Orleans, it's about 90% of the students in the public system go to charter schools. Kansas City, it's about 45%. Newark, Detroit, places like that, it's close to half the students go to charter schools. And so this gives you a state-by-state representation of that. But as I mentioned, in particular in some metropolitan areas, it's a much more concentrated participation of charter schools. At the same time, also starting in the 1990s, people started to implement Milton Friedman's idea from 1955 of school vouchers. And again, you're probably familiar with the idea of giving money to the families and letting them choose which schools they send their children to, whether it's public or private schools. This initially came out in 1955, and it was embraced by people trying to avoid desegregation efforts in the South. But in the 1960s and 1970s, some liberals and leftists also embraced this idea, thinking this is a good way to get kids that are stuck in failing schools a more equitable opportunity for quality education. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that in the case of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that the voucher schools do not violate the separation of church and state, because it's not the state sending money directly to religious schools, it's states sending the money to families who make an independent decision than to send the money to private schools. And we've seen a kind of incremental growth of these schools state by state. A lot of state constitutions have very prohibitive language about public funding going to private or sectarian schools. And so in many cases, voucher advocates have run into these so-called Blaine amendments that really are difficult for voucher advocates to overcome. So they've looked to other mechanisms, such as I mentioned before, education savings accounts, where you essentially give the families a debit card for $7,000, whatever it is, and they can spend it where they want on education. Just in terms of, sorry, this is, there we go. And as I mentioned, this is also a national phenomenon. You see it less in the western states, but there's different forms of vouchers, as I mentioned. Tuition tax credits, where people get credit for the money they spend on tuition, for example, or these education savings accounts. And as you probably know, Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, is a big fan of school vouchers. So what do we know about these types of education policies? For decades, people had sent their children to private schools, typically Catholic schools, not because they get better results, but because they reflected the family's religious beliefs. And they saw that as a way of confirming or supporting those family beliefs. Starting in the 1980s, though, researchers started to look at the actual effects of these different types of schools. And in particular, James Coleman, who made a mark in the 1960s with the report on school equity and funding, started to look at this. We've known for a long time that kids in private schools score higher. The question is it because they're getting a better education in private schools, or is it because families with children who would likely get higher scores tend to be sent to private schools? So Coleman started to tease that out a bit, and he argued that once you actually control for the differences in the family characteristics of people that send their kids to public schools versus private schools, there still is an effect for private schools, what he called the private school effect. That they seem to be doing something that boosts students' achievement more so than they would if they had been in public schools. That research was supported in a major study in the early 1990s by Chubb and Moe, who looked at national level data and tried to, again, find out, is there a private school effect? And they argued that because district schools are bureaucratically run, they're less responsive, they're less innovative, and therefore less effective. There's been also more localized studies in places like Milwaukee and Cleveland, Washington, D.C. that have citywide voucher programs. So you give students in public schools a voucher to go to a private school. And some of those researchers used randomized trials where they're able to set up control and experimental groups and finding out if kids who won a lottery to get a voucher, did they do better? And their argument was that there was an effect. If a kid won a voucher, they were able to go to a private school, and that improved their education more so than kids that randomly didn't win that voucher and stayed in public schools. That was the consensus in that research. And they argued that because it's randomized, it's like a medical trial, so it's gold standard, they were arguing. Nonetheless, there's been quite an industry forming around not just the advocacy around these types of reform models, but the schools themselves. Groups like the National Heritage Academies is a major provider of services to charter schools. They run a lot of charter schools across many different states. The National School Boards Association has weighed in on this. They're quite concerned about the question of vouchers. As I mentioned, President Trump and Betsy DeVos have a very explicit view on this. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about some of these professional organizations, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics.
So hi, thanks again for having us. Chris is the policy wonk, and I'm the data, statistics, and math education wonk, so we trade off. And it's a weird pairing, but it works in this study. So since 1989, the mathematics education community has really been behind this reform by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And, okay. What that looks like has been a push for less teacher lecture and students sitting in rows, doing computations with a lot of drill and practice, and more emphasis on really understanding the mathematical concepts, more problem solving, and more balance across 5 strands. So traditionally in the 70s, you would see just, like 90% of the curriculum would be number computation, and there's been a push for a broader emphasis on geometry, probability, and statistics, which really wasn't in the curriculum before the late 80s, and algebra, even in early grades, to try to get fundamentals of, what is a variable, those types of things. So in that context, I was doing some work with national data sets like I do, and was trying to really look at this reform movement and trying to figure out which students are getting what type of instruction, is it helping? And in the process of that, I ran across this weird negative coefficient for private schools that surprised me. And I thought, I'm conditioning on all these demographics. Why is it that private schools have a negative coefficient, meaning that the students there seem to actually have worse math achievement? And so this caused Chris and me to start collaborating on another national data set, a bigger one that had just come out, to look at these questions of how does public school math achievement compare with that in demographically similar charter, Catholic, and other types of private schools, and what differences in school climate and instruction might explain any differences in achievement that there are. I'm going to be talking about NAEP, sorry, okay. What's sometimes called the nation's report card, but this is the closest thing we have to a national test that gives us a representative sample of the states and the nation. And there's a long-term trend NAEP, which has the same questions on it that it had in the 1970s, but then there's a main NAEP that moves away from this computation focus. And it's sensitive to trends, and it involves both multiple choice and open-ended math items, and it includes not only student achievement data, but student surveys and teacher surveys and administrator surveys. So there's a lot of data in there. Just as a rough guide, because we'll be looking at some scores. You can think of 10 or 12 points as roughly a grade level as we look at some graphs here. Why is that not here? Sorry, I'm not sure. Okay, so this just shows the increase in, a comparison between public and private school scores on the 4th grade NAEP. And you can see that there were larger differences in the early 90s through about 2000, and that there's been some narrowing of the gap there. But still, private schools are higher, and as Chris said, is that because private schools serve students that would be higher achieving anyway, or what's the deal? So NAEP has a lot of background variables. I'm not going to read this all to you, but I just want you to know that there's a lot of school-level demographics and student-level demographics that we could use in our models to try to, sort out the question about the effects of demographics versus the actual school. And here, there's too much on the screen for you to really process, but it just shows public, Catholic, Lutheran, conservative Christian, and other types of private, and finally charter, and the demographics in each. And you can see that public schools and charter schools tend to serve students who are, more likely to be on free lunch. They're more likely to be Black or Hispanic or have limited English proficiency. So they're definitely serving different demographics of students. And so that has to be accounted for. So at this point in the talk, when I talk at universities, this is where we have like 10 screens of higher level, hierarchical linear modeling results that I'm going to skip for you and just show you the bar graph that comes out of it at the end. You're welcome. Some of you, if you can see the book if you would like that. Go back one. Is that okay? Is that okay? I'm going to move this because I'm having trouble seeing which slide we're on. Okay. So this is just showing that the differences between the mean achievement and public schools. This is before. Oh, right. Okay, sorry. So the black bars on top are simply, so the Catholic on the left, it's showing that if you don't condition on demographics, they're scoring about 9 points higher. 0 baseline. Yeah, 0 you can think of as the public school, what they're scoring. But once you condition on demographics and you're looking at apples to apples within the schools, Catholic school students are doing about 7 points worse. Lutheran schools 4 points worse, conservative Christians over 11 points, and so on. So again, different schools have different missions, and it might not be every school's mission to have their students score well on NAEP. So that's, I want to acknowledge that this isn't the be-all and end-all measure of what every school should be focusing on. But it tends to be what policymakers are focusing on and trying to implement their various programs, and so it makes sense to look at these. This is, okay, so that was 4th grade. This is 8th grade, and you can just see the pattern is similar, a little lessened, but similar. And so this is a summary of the school and teacher variables that seem to matter. So these are things that, the things that were more prevalent in public schools than in demographically similar private schools, and that predict higher achievement are having more certified teachers, having more reform-oriented instruction, and by that, there are things like they're not just focusing on number, but have more balanced curriculum that includes geometry, probability, algebra, which aligns more with the test. And students are asked things like, is learning math just memorizing facts? And the public school students are less likely to think that learning math is just memorizing facts, and the private school students, once you condition on demographics, are more likely to think learning math is just memorizing facts. And then there are some things that were mixed in terms of which type of school had more, and one of those things was parent involvement, student attendance. So these things are higher in private, but when you condition on demographics, there's actually not consistent differences like some would believe. And then smaller class sizes actually do predict higher achievement, and they're more prevalent in private and charter schools. So that piece is helping those schools. And so, yeah. Okay, we did all this with NAEP, and the problem with NAEP is that it's cross-sectional, meaning it doesn't follow the same students over time. It's looking at a point in time. What's great about NAEP is you don't have attrition over time because it's just one-shot look. But some criticize the results of this, saying, well, maybe the private school students start out lower. That was one of the things. So at this point, this was a few years ago, a new data set was coming out that had followed students from kindergarten through 5th grade. And so we looked at that data set. So yeah, again, the limitations of NAEP. There was no information prior to grade 4 with NAEP. So we couldn't look at what happens with kindergarten through 4th. And then another limitation of NAEP is it's all student reported, and some school reported SES variables. There's nothing parent reported. So we looked at another data set that's called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, and asked these questions of how does kindergarten achievement in public and private schools compare? Might it be true that private school students actually start lower for whatever reason, and that's why we're seeing what we're seeing? And how does the growth from kindergarten to 5th compare? So just a really brief overview of ECLS-K data. It's about 10,000 students, 1,500 schools. Because this is a smaller sample than NAEP, it's about 1/10 the size, so we can't follow all different types of schools, but we can look at public, private, and Catholic, actually, and then other private. For those who like statistics, we use multi-level modeling, which deals with the fact that you've got kids nested within schools, nested within, so if you don't care, that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to cut to the results. We found that initial public school kindergarten achievement is equal to or less than that in private schools. So public school kids are not starting out higher. They're starting out, if anything, lower or roughly equal to demographically similar peers in private. And then, the kindergarten to 5th grade growth in public schools is equal to that or larger than demographically similar private schools. So, and it's not huge, but it basically is showing that the public school kids start out lower and end up a little higher. So why is this happening? So from my mathematics education standpoint, I like to look at all those variables about instruction and certified teachers. And one of the things that is popular to think about is autonomy, and teacher autonomy is a good thing, and it seems on the face of it, it's good, and there are many good things about that. However, it seems like when you look at the data from private schools, they're free to hire whoever they want, whether they're certified or not, and those uncertified teachers tend to have, students are scoring lower. And they can use whatever curriculum they want and aren't beholden to the latest standards by national organizations such as the National Council of Teachers of Math. And maybe, again, that seems like a good thing that they can teach whatever they want. However, it makes sense that if they're not keeping up with where the field of math education is going and what's on the test for the nation, it makes sense that those students aren't going to score as well. So from my standpoint, that dangers of autonomy, that's kind of a double-edged sword of autonomy, is something to be thinking more about. So in trying to look across the first NAEP analysis with like 100,000 kids and then the ECLS-K analysis, which followed about 10,000 kids over time, there are some things that consistently showed up as predictors of achievement and helped explain this public school advantage. And one was more certified teachers. Another is more reform-oriented instruction that's keeping up with the times, essentially. And then in the NAEP, you could look at students' reform-oriented beliefs, and even students liking mathematics was something. They like math more in public schools compared to demographically similar kids in demographically similar private schools. So, okay. So this was all a few years ago. There is another wave of the ECLS-K data out, and we've peeked at it to see how our result, how things look, and it looks like it's going to be the same story. And so and another study just came out a couple of weeks ago from someone else with a different data set. It's the same story. So when we first found these results, I actually felt like we were really out there, and that, did we do something wrong kind of question, but it's just, there's been consistent data that whenever anyone looks at a national data set with the US, they're finding a similar thing. Typically the effect is the public school advantage is there more for math than for reading, and one could argue that math is learned more in school, whereas reading can be influenced, kids read at home a lot more than they do math with their parents at bedtime, despite what I might want, but anyway. So we're going to go back to Chris to talk about the policy stuff.
So we came up with these results, and like I said, we didn't expect to see these, and we put out a paper, and it got some attention, and some pushback, I should say. So it started a bit of a national debate. We had both been through grad school, and we assumed that there was a public school detriment, that there was, in fact, private schools were more effective. So we never really questioned that. When we found this pattern, we were quite surprised, and you can imagine a lot of people, especially people who are very much in favor of privatization of education, weren't too happy with that. So we initially published some papers around this and released some and got some press attention, and as I mentioned, some people were pushing back on us and doing some reanalysis. However, I will say that, as Sarah just mentioned, since we've come out with these data, we've seen other studies from Education Testing Service, from Harvard, Stanford, and the anti-Catholic bastion of University of Notre Dame have also found that public schools are actually outperforming private schools. So we feel, like Sarah said, much less vulnerable now, that there's definitely something here. We put out this book and that also got some attention. And then there was some interesting media around that. John Stossel, for example, you're laughing, me too. Noted statistician John Stossel pushed back on us and said that we were torturing the data, and that we were trying to find some preconceived conclusions out of this. So some of the interesting stuff was this in the Atlantic, did a piece about are private schools worth it? And then the Daily Caller, I don't know if you know the conservative website, they had an interesting headline, do private schools suck even worse than public schools? But going out of the kind of the blogosphere and all this internet stuff that happens, looking back at the research, it's interesting to think again about what we thought we knew before these studies came out. And it really does seem to turn on its head the earlier assumption and finding that there is a private school effect. We didn't come up with the name of public school advantage. Our editor forced that on us. But there does seem to be some additional effect from public schools, in particular around mathematics achievement. And some of these voucher studies that I mentioned before had tried to weigh in on this. They argued, kids that took a voucher in Cleveland did better. But remember, those are small-scale localized programs, means tested. When we've started to scale those up, when we scaled it up in a sense with these national studies, but more recent voucher studies have come up with a very different conclusion. And you might be familiar with some of this. There's been some randomized controlled trials, statewide voucher systems in Louisiana, Ohio. Indiana was not a randomized one, but it was still pretty high quality study. Washington, D.C. Every one of these in the last 3 years have found large negative impacts for kids using vouchers to go to private schools, that it substantially hurts their academic performance, including in Indiana. And that is noteworthy. So just in conclusion, you want to come up and talk about? We're not arguing. We often get parents call us and say, oh, should I send my kid to the local public school or private school? We're not arguing about specific schools here. These are nationally representative data sets. They're averages. So we can't really say if the local school that's a Catholic school is any better or worse than the local public school. That's not the point here. But that said, there's some fantastic schools in different sectors, and there's some pretty bad schools. But nonetheless, these data suggest that public schools are actually doing a pretty good job, especially considering the challenge that they have and the fact that they're dealing with a different population.
Oh, so one of the arguments for private schools that came out of research in the 80s was that even if private schools aren't better overall, they're better for poor kids or they're better for Hispanic kids. And there were some data that seemed to support that. We didn't see any of that in our data, and no significant positive, difference, I guess, between how the effect for poor kids, rich kids, black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids. So, and other studies have similarly not seen the same effect. So it could be that it was true in the 80s and we're not seeing it now. It could be that methods are different, data are different, and yeah, I don't know. The dangers of greater autonomy, I mentioned already. I mean, just in general, it seems like if a school is kind of appealing to parents who may want a traditional education and there's no real impetus to make them change, it feels like, looking at the data, a lot of private schools are doing a really good job of offering a 1970s education in math to their students, where they're sitting in rows and doing arithmetic. And yeah, so there seem to be some dangers of just of letting people hire who they want and do what they want, even though it sounds really good on the face of it, and there are benefits to that.
And similar to that, related to that, and some of the other work I've been doing around how schools operate within more competitive environments when you have more voucher school options and charter schools. We're, again, increasing the autonomy for a lot of these schools. Charter schools are quite free to do what they want in a lot of cases. But we're seeing some negative effects of that in many cases, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. Schools are taking money out of instruction and putting more funds into marketing, for example. They're also doing things to kind of keep out the bad students and just work with the better students, which should be of concern. So we're seeing evidence of that in a number of countries, actually. And also, I want to return to an earlier point. That some reformers have argued that privatization is a panacea, that there are self-correcting mechanisms within a private market-like environment where schools will have to do a good job or go out of business. They'll have to succeed or get shut down. But we're not seeing that, not only with these data here, but also with looking at how schools are operating in these types of environments. So it's far from a panacea, and there does seem to be some negative impacts for forcing schools to be to compete. Yeah, so the last one is taking an individual student from a public school, a failing public school, and putting them in a private school. Does that have a positive impact? And some of our data suggests that there's reasons to be cautious about those types of claims, which are really behind a lot of the reform models like charter schools and vouchers. There is, in fact, though, a benefit to taking a kid out of a poorer environment and putting him or her in a wealthier environment, surrounded by wealthier peers who talk about how they're going to finish their homework, who talk about where they're going to go to college. That matters, whether the school is public or private. The issue, though, is as we move towards a more privatized model with charter schools and vouchers, for example, we're kind of segregating the kids from families who really care a lot about education into certain schools. And so that effect is really pronounced for them, but it's diminished for the kids who are staying behind in public schools. And as we try and scale up these programs into statewide efforts, such as in Indiana's voucher program, there's only so many wealthy peers to go around. And so what we see is a greater segregation of those types of peer effects, and it impacts the kids who probably need the most help in the worst way. So that's it. We're glad to answer that.
I just have one question just to know, in the public schools, is there as extensive inclusion of students in math classes as there might be in the private school?
Special needs students?
No, I mean, do many kids, percentage of the school kids in public schools take math, yes, in the private schools?
So I think you're asking, like at the high school level, are more private schools do private school kids, basically, are they required to take more math, or do they take more math? I don't know that. We really focused on the data that, there's more good data, or at least there was when we did this, at the elementary and middle school level. And I also think that it's easier to segregate the peer effects and the family effects if you're looking at younger kids. As soon as you get to kids doing hours of homework outside of school and going to their SAT prep schools and whatever, it becomes harder. So we have not studied high schools, and which is actually another thing that we should be mentioning, is that a lot of the earlier work that decided that private schools were better were based on high schools. But I also think it's just a different time and different tests, and yeah.
Public schools are reformed.
Yeah. But if I had to guess from a math education standpoint, I would guess that there really probably isn't a difference. It really, yeah, it depends on the school.
I went to 3 local schools in New York City, from the 1st to the 4th grade, and then 7th to the 8th grade. And this was in the 1950s, 1960s, when my parents had to pay for this. There was no government subsidy. I found it very isolating, but not realizing it until later. I went to public schools during the 5th and 6th grade, which is the first time I met and talked to a black student, an Hispanic student, a Jewish student, a Chinese student, and they may have been one white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And public schools were fine. The school that I went to wanted us to start out early on math. So in the 8th grade, I was taking algebra, which is not easy to go to math. So when I got to high school, regular public high school, I scored a 98 on the New York State algebra regions. Because it was a refresher course, I had already taken it. And I never matched that again. The only reason my college degree is a BA and not a BS, I failed calculus 3 times in college. So there are benefits and drawbacks to public schools and to private schools. But what struck me most, it's so isolating. You know, if my mother had found a Greek high school, I would have accepted a Greek high school. Luckily, she didn't find it. But it's, aside from the educational values of the teaching methods, it is so isolating. Because you don't, I grew up in a very well-educated area of Queens, New York. But for those years in local schools, it was surrounded by nothing but Greek American students. It was very isolating. And that's
I mean, I went to Catholic schools for my education, so I went to certain Christian schools, and they were somewhat segregated by race and class. And I think a lot of people send their children to those schools for that reason, to get them out of other, the environment they associate with public schools. That said, our daughters have gone to public schools, and we're in much more diverse environments, and really benefited from that. And if you look at the data here, at the demographics of public schools, they're much more diverse and serve a much broader population than do private schools now. That said, that's within the sector. Still, public schools are very segregated in the U.S., and we're moving largely back to a very segregated model, unfortunately, largely because they reflect the residential patterns that we've arranged ourselves in.
Demographics that you're talking about beyond the control of schools to deal with. We have an exaggerated case in Bloomington, in that Bloomington is economically segregated, east-west. All the Title I schools, save one, are west of Walnut College. And one that's east is for all educational policy, but public policy, how do we address some of these issues in terms of where we create housing, and the things that in public policy, as opposed to saying this is the school's fault, it's community's fault, it's developers' fault, it's how we approach it in many ways. And something, we created a situation in Bloomington in terms of economic distribution that is almost impossible to address.
And some of that has to do with the peer mix, as we mentioned before. Taking a poor child and sticking them in a wealthier environment does have some beneficial impacts for them, and it doesn't seem to have much in the way of detrimental impacts on the wealthier kids around there. So there is an argument for socioeconomic integration, very much so. And we know that has an impact. As a matter of fact, I'll put in a little plug here. I saw that Nicole Hannah-Jones, the New York Times writer who's written about this quite a bit, is going to be speaking at Buskirk Chumley on November 1st. And she's done a lot of work on this. She herself is an African-American student in Iowa, experienced that type of efforts at integration. So anyways, there's definitely evidence that pays off quite a bit. Some people have talked about giving housing vouchers instead of school vouchers, getting kids out of that environment by where they live.
All right, let's go ahead and cut it off there. Will you guys be able to stick around
Absolutely.
Sure.
for a couple minutes afterwards? All right, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Just to recognize you guys being here today, we will be making a contribution actually to the Interfaith Winter Shelter for you guys speaking on to the club today. So thank you guys again. And speaking of that, the Area 10 Agency on Aging did send us a very nice thank you letter acknowledging our gift. I think I mentioned that, but here's the letter. And obviously they appreciate the gift, although it's a relatively small amount of money, but they do appreciate that. Program next week is the Business Outlook on Thursday at Woolery Mill. We do not have the meeting on Tuesday. And the thought for the week, I thought it was appropriate. If you purchase a lottery ticket on Monday for a jackpot that is being held on Wednesday, you are 100 times more likely to die before the drawing is held than to actually win the jackpot. I bought a ticket, for the record. But, all right, guys, have a great weekend. Ring the bell, or not ring the bell, rise, and we'll do the four-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it fun? Ding. Thank you.